Okay, I have started again. And let me just check my main page here. Okay. And all right, let's go here. Okay, I'm back. All right. Hello to Anrun Chachadson, our valiant moderator. Thank you for your service. Metal Mike, William Stewart. We're talking about Kamala, says William Stewart. Jeffrey Pye, hello. Let's circle back to that stream. Okay. I discovered I was complaining previously that it become difficult for me to read the responses in the chat, and then I realized that I could simply increase the size of this page. Just like it makes the picture smaller, but I don't really need a very big picture of myself. So William Hicks, yes, I can hear you. I was talking about Kamala. Yes, if Joe Biden is impeached, really unlikely, or the 25th Amendment is invoked, then Kamala Harris becomes president. Although there have been a number of disturbing rumors recently that no, Kamala Harris isn't going to become president. Someone else is going to become president. Well, who else would that be? Next in line after Kamala is Nancy Pelosi. I don't really know how this could work. But as I believe I was saying yesterday, if Joe Biden were to leave soon, tens of millions of Americans would be outraged, truly outraged, because they believe that they were given a bait and switch, that no, Joe Biden is too senile, etc., to be president. So we'll have Kamala there in the backup spot, and we'll get rid of Joe after less than a year. Well, why didn't they run Kamala in the first place? Well, she was the weakest candidate in the primaries. She's tremendously unpopular, and she cannot stop cackling or giggling in public when asked about serious things. She seems to have a mental disorder. Surely she's been told about this by her aides, or perhaps by President Biden, or more important, Dr. Jill Biden. Oscar Toe says, Kevin, what about the Senate confirmation on Kamala's VP? Would the Democrats still have the numbers to do this? I can't answer that question because this is really an unprecedented situation. Really unprecedented situation. That Nixon, of course, resigned, and he was replaced by Gerald Ford, who was thought to be a safe pair of hands. And Ford then quickly got Nelson Rockefeller, who I suppose was considered to be a safe pair of hands. You know how Nelson Rockefeller died? Anyone remember that? He died in the saddle, as they say. This was covered up for some time. Maybe Hillary is available, says LOL. LOL, says William Hicks. Did you see the picture of her on vacation that the Daily Mail had? Oh, boy. She looks like a likely COVID victim to me based on her girth. When she was running for president in 2016, how would I say, a rather spectacular kind of girdle was devised for her to make her look less obviously huge than she is. Ashley Main Bravo says, President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is saying that Biden is intentionally getting bad information by the CIA in order for Kamala Harris to get in. Yeah, I don't, they're supposed to be bright people, these people. But Kamala Harris, she's the first black vice president. Who gives a toss? There's already been a black president for 2 full terms. What does this woman have going for her? Nothing whatsoever. As I say, she went over like a lead balloon during the primaries. She also called Joe Biden a racist during the primaries. One would think that Joe would take that personally, but he named her Veep nonetheless. Pelosi isn't exactly loved, says William Hicks. No, not at all, actually. I was moving on from there to, well, hang on. What did I lose? I may have lost something here. Lindsey Graham, Cabell. Okay, let's just move on to this one. The Catholic Church has put his oar in. This is from Breitbart. Thomas Williams, the leader of the European Bishops' Conferences, Jesuit Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, has berated Europe and the West for their failure to open their borders to Afghan refugees fleeing the country. We are seeing very powerful images. They break my heart, the Cardinal told the news agency of the Italian bishops. It breaks my heart to see how people are treated. We had given these people hope, and now we have left them in Dante's inferno. Shame on Europe and the West. We talk a lot about values, but where are our values in Afghanistan now? Expect a bishop to use words stronger than values. Values are infinitely mutable. This is this fellow's worthless, absolutely worthless. Our politics has been misguided, he said. The only thing we are debating is what to do to avoid having a large number of refugees from Afghanistan rather than going to the aid of these people. And this attitude causes me shame. Why would it cause him shame? He is not responsible for any of this, and he's not even American. Thinking about putting these people in a refugee camp is like condemning them to despair. We already have camps in Libya for migrants from Africa, and we know very well what conditions are like in those camps. Oh, so the Libyans are not capable of looking after their own people? Well, Libya doesn't exist anymore. It was a fake country that was conjured up in, 1945, and now it's broken into 3 pieces. They have open-air slave markets in Libya now. The United States, Hillary Clinton, deliberately wrecked Libya. And but what does it matter now who's responsible, as Hillary would say? I could say that the Catholic Church is playing with fire here because the attitude from the Pope and most of its leaders is that nations have no right to exist. Well, again, if the church had taught from the very beginning that nations have no right to exist, then Christianity would have died in Israel in the 1st century A.D. Here is a story. Yes, License to Kill. Apparently, the rules, the Capitol Police Force, are not the same as the rules for police forces anywhere in the United States. Now, this is a story which I'm going to update. This is from Zenger.news, Hamel Harris and David Martusco. For more than 7 months, the U.S. Capitol Police officer who shot and killed Ashley Babbitt, an unarmed protester climbing through a broken window in a hallway of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, has remained anonymous. Though his name was known to U.S. Capitol Police, congressional staffers, and federal investigations, no one would divulge it. The secrecy fueled months of online speculation. Babbitt's family alleged a cover-up. The U.S. Congress wants to protect this man. He's got friends in high places, and they want to protect him, said Maryland attorney Terry Roberts, who represents the family. And they've done a pretty good job of it. I don't think it's a proud moment for the U.S. Capitol Police or the U.S. Congress. Roberts told Zenger Wednesday night that the shooter was Lieutenant Michael Leroy Byrd. Byrd's attorney, Mark Schammel, did not dispute the positive identification. It adds to information from other sources who told Zenger in recent months that Byrd was the shooter. None of them would say so on the record. I was wondering, I've known this man's name for weeks, as of many others, but I hadn't used it on this stream because previously, when I'd mentioned the name of the so-called whistleblower in Ukraine Gate, despite the fact that it was widely known, YouTube shut down the stream immediately. So I started calling him Bagpipe because that's what his name means in Italian. Byrd is a controversial figure with a record of mishandling firearms, including once leaving a loaded pistol in a congressional visitor center bathroom. Robert says Byrd's decision to fire his weapon on January 6 indicated his unfitness for duty. If I was a congressman, I'd be very concerned about him carrying a gun around me, he said. Typically, police officers who shoot civilians are named publicly, but the January 6th riot and the riots that erupted after George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer divided the country along political class and racial lines, making officials cautious about revealing the name of a black police officer who killed a white protester. Roberts said race was clearly a factor in the decision to shield Byrd from public scrutiny. It's something that has to be considered because it's just a clear pattern in the United States, he said. A white cop kills a black individual, their name is out there within a day. It's all public. And look, a police officer is a public official. There should not be any exception for this. U.S. Capitol Police officials, police union representatives, and government officials had repeatedly claimed that disclosing the officer's identity would put his life and his wife's in danger and subject them to racial slurs. This is a new one to me. I've heard of the old one, I'm sure you all have too, which is I shouldn't be punished for murder because the N-word was used. Okay, what we're seeing now is this man who killed an unarmed woman should not be named because the N-word might be used. After not naming Byrd publicly for months, Babbitt's lawyer said he became skeptical when he learned Wednesday that the officer was set to appear with Lester Holt in an NBC News broadcast the following day, and that NBC had already taped the interview. They put out there that his life would be in danger if he came forward, and we now know that that can't be true because he's coming forward on his own. Robert says, so you know, he used that as an excuse. Roberts, the Babbitt's family lawyer, is planning a wrongful death lawsuit naming both Byrd and the U.S. Capitol Police as defendants. The suit has yet to be filed due to a federal law requiring a months-long notice period before such actions can be brought against government agencies. Byrd was not justified in killing Babbitt, Roberts said, because he had no reason to believe the unarmed Babbitt posed a threat to himself or others. Byrd fired the only shot at the Capitol on January 6th, and Babbitt was the only person there killed by gunfire that day. Byrd's own lawyer, Mark Schammel, insisted on his client's anonymity since April loudly and always citing the officer's physical security. What about the physical security of officers across America who have killed Black people and have been forced to flee their towns, their cities? What about them? Most of these white officers get shit-canned almost immediately, even before trial. But there was something very special about this Byrd fellow. Running the name of a hero who has the need for 24-hour protection is disgusting and indefensible, Schammel said July the 9th in a text message. He was responding directly to a question that mentioned Byrd by name. Is Byrd's decision to grant a public interview an indication that fears for his safety were unfounded? Zengner asked him during a phone call Wednesday night. Not in any way, shape, or form, Schammel replied. Minutes later, he texted, I confirm that my client is a hero. My client justifiably used force to protect members of Congress from an imminent threat posed by violent rioters, and that he shot the first rioter who breached the inner sanctum of the House of Representatives, and there is no basis in law or fact for a civil case against him or the Capitol Police. If the violent insurrectionist who died, that is Babbitt, had survived, Schammel wrote, she would have been indicted on felony charges and would have been on her way to prison with her fellow insurrectionists. Again, I can't say this often enough. It's a very funny kind of insurrection where the insurrectionists don't bring weapons, don't build barricades, don't attempt to secure and seize a building, but simply leave after about an hour. And more from the Daily Mail on this story. And the Daily Mail has been one of the few outlets, mainstream outlets, which has covered this story. Well, I think what the Babbitt family lawyer is saying is absolutely true. Optics look very bad. Black man kills unarmed white woman. You remember in Minneapolis, or a Minneapolis police officer, a Somali, shot an Australian who was visiting. She was sitting in a car, and he just shot her because he panicked over nothing at all. Do you recall that being a page one story? Top of the internet story in the United States? No, it was not. So Lieutenant Michael Leroy Bird is 53 years old and a 28-year police veteran. And he's going to be interviewed by Lester Holt. I assume it will be a very friendly interview. Perhaps he will shed some tears, not for Ashley Babbitt, but for the trauma that he suffered by shooting an unarmed woman, and the fear that he would be named. Arizona Representative Paul Gosar said July the 6th, 6 months ago today, Ashley Babbitt, a 110-pound woman with nothing in her hands, not a rock, not a stick or a bat, was shot dead by a still unknown Capitol Hill police officer. Following Bird's decision to speak out, the Daily Mail has decided it's time to publish the name of the officer, who, unlike virtually all his colleagues nationwide who have made the split-second decision to shoot, has been allowed to hide behind his badge. Oh, he's been exonerated, too, by the way. Details? No, we're not going to get any. Apparently, the Capitol Police is pretty much above the law in the United States, that they can do pretty much whatever they like. Quite a turnaround, given the months of constantly saying that to identify him would expose him to danger. Where did that one go? Says Roberts, the Babbitt family lawyer. Her widower, Erin Babbitt, filed a lawsuit claiming the Metropolitan Police Department failed to comply with the Freedom of Information Act request, either to provide or deny his request for information. Yeah. Yes. Father of two Bird's actions were deemed lawful by the Department of Justice said in April. There was no evidence to support a criminal prosecution. In that announcement, the department did not identify him. Someone whose name we won't mention is not going to be prosecuted for something or other. Dozens of other officers who have shot people, either with justification or not, have been identified publicly immediately after the incidents. In April, Officer Nicholas Reardon was named within a day of fatally firing 4 shots at knife-wielding 16-year-old Makia Bryant as she charged at 2 women in Columbus, Ohio. Basketball superstar LeBron James later tweeted Reardon's picture with the words, "You're next." White House Press Secretary not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki said Bryant's death underscored the systemic racism in the nation's policing. Also in April, Kim Potter was named as the officer who shot and killed Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. She says she mistakenly drew her gun instead of her taser. And Eric Stillman was identified as the Chicago cop who fatally shot 13-year-old Adam Toledo during a foot chase in March. Justice for some and not for others. Status justice. A return to the status justice of medieval times, as Thomas Fleming pointed out some years ago. You were no longer judged on the law or any moral precepts. You are judged on your status within society. And it would seem that a black Capitol Hill police officer has very high status indeed in the United States. This is a story from the New York Times, and I suppose you could say that it is a example of the new journalism, not the new journalism that Tom Wolfe identified, gonzo journalism, first-person journalism, but a kind of journalism where here's a thing that happened, and it's a good thing. And of course, it's a good thing because we're saying that it's a good thing. Why would anyone disagree with this? We just told you that it's a good thing. This is by Emma Goldberg. The Puritan colonists who settled in New England in the 1630s had a nagging concern about the churches they were building. How would they ensure that the clergymen would be literate? Their answer was Harvard University, a school that was established to educate the ministry and adopted the motto, Truth for Christ and the Church. It was named after a pastor, John Harvard, and it would be more than 70 years before the school had a president who was not a clergyman. Nearly 4 centuries later, Harvard's organization of chaplains has elected as its next president an atheist named Greg Epstein, who takes on the job this week. Epstein, 44, author of the book Good Without God, is a seemingly unusual choice for the role. He will coordinate the activities of more than 40 university chaplains who lead the Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and other religious communities on campus. Yet many Harvard students, some raised in families of faith, others never quite certain how to label their religious identities, attest to the influence that Epstein has had on their spiritual lives. There is a rising group of people who no longer identify with any religious tradition, but still experience a real need for conversation and support around what it means to be a good human and live an ethical life, said Epstein, who was raised in a Jewish household and has been Harvard's humanist chaplain since 2005, teaching students about the progressive movement that centers people's relationships with one another instead of with God. To Epstein's fellow campus chaplains, at least, the notion of being led by an atheist is not as counterintuitive as it might sound. His election was unanimous. If this is the way that Harvard thinks, then clearly they should just abolish their chaplaincy program and replace it with rapping about feelings. I mean, that would be more to the point. Maybe in a more conservative university client, there might be a question like, what the heck are they doing at Harvard having a humanist being president of the chaplains, said Margaret Hammerstrom, the Christian Science chaplain at Harvard. But in this environment, it works. Greg is known for wanting to keep lines of communication open between different faiths. The dozens of students whom Epstein mentors have found a source of meaning in the school's organization of humanists, atheists, and agnostics, reflecting a broader trend of young people across the United States who increasingly identify as spiritual, but religiously non-affiliated. That trend might be especially salient at Harvard. A Harvard Crimson survey of the class of 2019 found that those students were 2 times more likely to identify as atheist or agnostics than 18-year-olds in the general population. Greg's leadership isn't about theology, said Charlotte Nickerson, 20, an electrical engineering student. It's about cooperation between people of different faiths and bringing together people who wouldn't normally consider themselves religious. The Harvard chaplains play an outsized role on campus, touching hundreds of students' lives, whether through Mass offered by the Catholic Student Center or Shabbat dinners at Harvard Hillel. Its leader reports directly to the office of the university president. We don't look to a God for answers, Epstein said. We are each other's answers. Then why do we need to talk to anybody at all? Why does there need to be someone in a position of authority there? Because a chaplain is a bigger authority. If you want to, rap about spirituality or your feelings or how to be ethical in a godless world, couldn't you just turn to the person next to you? Epstein's work includes hosting dinners for undergraduates where conversation goes deep. Does God exist? What is the meaning of life? Wow, this guy's a revelation. I mean, who's ever asked those questions before? But apparently the point of religion was that it said that it had answers to those questions. Epstein previously ran a congregation of Boston area humanists and atheists who met in Harvard Square for weekly services that centered on secular sermons. In 2018, he closed that down to focus his time on building campus relationships, including at MIT, where he is also a chaplain. Epstein frequently meets individually with students who are struggling with issues both personal and theological, counseling them on managing anxiety about summer jobs, family feuds, the pressures of social media, and the turbulence endemic Too Good Life. Gregor's irreverent and good at diffusing pressure, Nickerson says. Recalling a time, he joked that if her summer internship got too stressful, she could always get fired. Then she would have a good story to share. Some of the students drawn to Epstein's secular community are religious refugees. Yay! People raised in observant households, boo, who arrive at college seeking spiritual meaning in a less rigid form. Adele Goldenberg, 22, grew up in a Hasidic community in Brooklyn, where she recalls being told that she could not attend college. In preschool, when asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, her answer was simple: a bride. Boo! Was the only thing she could envision for a girl like herself. When she turned 19, she applied to Harvard in secret and fled the community. Once at Harvard, she was wary of assuming any religious label, but she still yearned to find people wrestling with issues deeper than academic achievement. Is there much attention paid to academic achievement at Harvard these days? She started attending meetings of the humanist group and discovered in Epstein a form of mentorship that felt almost like having a secular rabbi, she said. When the pandemic hit, I was like, Greg, do you have time to talk about the meaning of life? Goldenberg recalled. He showed me that it's possible to find community outside a traditional religious context, that you can have the value add religion has provided for centuries, which is that it's there when things seem chaotic. If simply talking with other people was sufficient to answer the deep questions of life and to allay any anxieties that people might have, then there would be no need for religion at all. Certainly no need for chaplains. Goldenberg reflected anew on how unlikely her path had been. Yeah, it sounds very unlikely indeed. There are a great many stories in the New York Times and elsewhere these days cheering people who come from Orthodox Jewish traditions or Hasidic traditions. And it's always the same. These are prisons, especially for women. And there's one woman who, she's some sort of fashion idol now and talks about her orgasms and vibrators, and which is, so much better than, being an Orthodox Jew. And okay, so who else is interviewed here? AJ Kumar says, being able to find values in rituals, but not having to believe in magic, that's a powerful thing. Some people might be insulted by this term magic, but it's clear who's on top at Harvard University. Other Harvard chaplains have applauded Epstein's efforts to provide a campus home for those who are religiously unattached, skeptical, but still searching. Some said his selection to lead the group following its previous Jewish leader seemed obvious. Greg was the first choice of a committee that was made up of a Lutheran, a Christian Scientist, an evangelical Christian, and a Baha'i, said the Reverend Kathleen Reed, a Lutheran chaplain who chaired the nominating committee. Nickerson grew up in a working-class Catholic household. Boo! And who else do we have? Yes, okay. So, controversial story, not really controversial. This is the message of this from the New York Times. And I want to ask Emma Goldberg, did you attempt to interview anyone, a single person who was troubled or angered by Harvard's decision? If not, why not? This is the new journalism. Increasingly, you see this. Well, we don't want to talk to a bunch of bigots, do we? Well, another obvious question would be one that I raised earlier. If we're all agreed now that religion is magic and it is surplus to the requirements of modern life, particularly Harvard life, why does this chaplaincy program still exist? I suppose it's a good gig for the people who are involved in it. I'm going to tell you something surprising. It's true. Don't be shocked all at once. Male votes count just as much as female votes. Yeah, I know, it took my breath away when I first heard that. I've read dozens of stories like this over the last 20 years, maybe longer, hundreds of stories. This is by Max Fawcett, who doesn't even pretend to be anything other than a propagandist, in the National Observer, How to Alienate Female Voters the Conservative Party of Canada Way. In the annals of annoying portmanteaus, the phrase she session doesn't even come close to the top 10. Yes, it does. But when it comes to triggering conservatives, it might be at the top of the list. Witness the overreaction last week to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's usage of it from conservative social media users and outlets like the Post Millennial. It even captured the attention of Jordan Peterson, a guy who knows a thing or two about overwrought reactions. This is not how serious adults discuss anything of import, Peterson tweeted. That this is, as they say in poker, a tell. After all, the Brexit portmanteau didn't elicit this sort of response from conservative thinkers and has been happily endorsed by politicians like Andrew Scheer and Jason Kenney. Well, the reason that Brexit was endorsed by everybody, whether they were in favor of it or not, gives you an idea of just how successful a portmanteau it is. Britain, exit, Brexit. It's a strong word. It leaps off easily off the tongue. She session and she covery. You hear the words she session. What does that mean? Does that mean women are leaving? They're leaving what? And where are they going? She covery? It sounds rather like witchcraft somehow. Yeah. This inconsistency may help to explain why conservatives continue to poll so poorly among women in Canada, while the Liberal lead on them has narrowed from unfathomably big to merely massive. It's still a chasm that separates the CPC from any hope of governing. Okay, well, the Conservatives are now slightly ahead of the Liberals in the polls. So they were, at one point, the Liberals were 24 percentage points ahead. Now they're down to 13 points ahead among women. If they're equal in the polls, that tells you that the Liberals have a huge deficit in male voters. But that's not the problem, because apparently the votes of men don't count as much. But strangely enough, they do. Mocking a phrase like she session isn't going to help the Conservatives with women, especially since it was coined by someone who is a professionally serious adult. Armin Yelnizyan, a writer and thinker who watched the last major economic crisis from her perch as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives senior economist. How about watch the last major economic crisis as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives senior economist? Her perch. Why was that phrase necessary? When the pandemic hit, she tweeted back in March, it was clear this would be the first ever service-led and consequently women-led economic downturn, a she session. It only took days for statistics in countries that preceded us to make us clear this was going to be a fact. Globally, various people, including Canada's female Minister of Finance, have been attempting to make she session and she recovery or she covery a meme. It has not worked for reasons that I presented above. As PwC noted earlier this year, COVID-19 and the unequal burden it placed on women has reversed years of gains they had just made in the workforce. The planted axiom in all of this is that women have to be in the workforce. And before the COVID-19 recession, they had passed men by percentage of workers in the United States of America, which is really rather shocking. But no, freedom. Women will not have freedom until all of them become wage slaves. Well, what about the kiddies? Well, the kiddies can be looked after by strangers. Are you seriously attempting to tell me that it is better for a child to be raised by its mother instead of strangers? That sounds rather, well, what does it sound? Does it sound bigoted? Does it sound misogynist? Because mothers are women exclusively. We see here the alliance, the exceedingly powerful alliance of capitalism and feminism. Capitalism wanted lower wages, so flooding the workforce with new workers got that effect. And the wages, inflation adjusted, of working class men in the United States have stalled or fallen since 1970. Yes, let's have both mom and dad work, but perhaps they can carve out, 30 or 60 minutes of quality time every day. And all those trips to the fast food joints, that's very exciting for the kiddies, or, ordering in, because women cooking, why would a woman need or want to cook? That is definitely misogynist. Let's go back to the chat. Mother Society and Father State says true. Greenbird, freedom only sells to the already enslaved, says Brandon Smith. Contra Coup says pursuing the female vote isn't the magnanimous act that is made out to be. Women vote more often, live longer, and are more likely to be single-issue voters, easier to triangulate. A Red Sulfur says women don't really listen to men or empathize. It's all mimicry. Well, no, I think there's a lot of truth in that, because the cliche is the reverse of this, that it's the man who's hiding behind the newspaper at the breakfast table. I suppose that speaks to a vanished society where husband and wife would actually sit down at a table and eat breakfast, or that people read newspapers. But no, men are, as a rule, exceedingly interested in women's feelings, and women are much less interested in men's feelings. How long was the power out for? Let's see, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, a little more than 5 hours. The children should be raised by the experts, says Oscar Toe. Hello to No Sleep Till Breezewood, Pennsylvania. Someone's talking about OnlyFans. Yeah, something curious happened with OnlyFans. OnlyFans said that they were going to kick off all of the porn, and they were seeking, big investors. Well, it turns out the porn is where the money comes from in OnlyFans, and they realized rather quickly that they weren't going to get big investors. I mean, okay, so there's a woman saying, and maybe she's a young, attractive woman, and maybe she's not wearing much in the way of clothing, and she's going blah, 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 my feelings, blah, 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 get vaccinated, wear a mask, etc. Here's a new dance that everyone's doing. Here's a parody of some song. People are doing that on TikTok for free. So OnlyFans without the porn makes no sense. And OnlyFans decided, what, about 2 weeks after they'd made their decision, that no, they were going to go back to the porn. Steve says, professionally serious adult. Yeah. Username available. You must listen to what I say, because I'm a professionally serious adult. In fact, I have a master's degree in serious professionalism. Of course, when I see graduate degrees that are handed out these days, I think, what is this? That this can't possibly be a field of graduate study. My retribution for the loons of Harwood would be to install E. Michael Jones as chaplain. Well, I guess you don't have to be a clergyman to be a chaplain at Harvard anymore. So I suppose it would be possible. Dan Allison says that guy's handing out tickets to hell. Only holy guys like that atheist can answer this age-old question, says Oscar Toe. Yeah, I don't know. I've noticed in recent years the tremendous growth in nihilism in American popular culture, as exemplified by shows like Rick and Morty. The universe is stochastic, and there could be infinite number of universes. So essentially, everything that we do is meaningless. Does that look like the route to personal contentment? There's very few people who can actually suffer the notion of a stochastic, pointless universe. But this is what is being foisted on us. Brandon Smith says, we don't look to God, we are God. Okay, let's go to Joseph Tainter and his Collapse of Complex Societies. A new chapter, The Nature of Complex Societies. And at the head is a quotation from the ruin from the 8th century Saxon Exeter book, remarking on Roman ruins in Britain. How wondrous this wall stone, shattered by fate, burg places broken, the work of giants crumbled. Ruined are the roofs, tumbled the towers, broken the barred gate, frost in the plaster, ceilings agaping, torn away, fallen, eaten by age. Bright were the halls, lofty gabled, many the bathhouse, cheerful the clamor, in many a mead hall, revelry rampant, until mighty fate put paid to all that. A study of why complex societies collapse should begin with a clear picture of what it is that does so. What, in other words, are complex societies? What are their defining characteristics? How do they differ from the simpler societies out of which they developed and to which they often revert? Are complex societies a discrete type or a stage in cultural evolution, or is there a continuum from simple to complex? A related question is why complex societies develop. This, as noted, has been a question of perennial interest in the social sciences. Although much is now known about the evolution of complexity, there is no overall consensus about such things as why complexity emerges, why societies become stratified, why these small independent groups of early human history have given way to the large interdependent states of recent millennia. This is no doubt a fascinating topic, and one that offers a tempting diversion for the present work. It is a diversion that will largely have to be resisted. It cannot be wholly resisted, for collapse may not be understood except in the context of how complex societies function and operate, and that cannot be divorced from the question of how they have come into being. As in any scientific endeavor, one question leads to another. One problem appears connected to all others, and one of the most difficult tasks is simply to draw boundaries to the inquiry. To explain collapse, it will be necessary to discuss briefly alternative general views of how complex societies have developed, and to evaluate the usefulness and relevance of these views to the problem at hand. The lively and interesting debate over what, if any, are the prime movers in the development of complexity is regrettably only partially pertinent. Accordingly, it will be treated in only a partial fashion. In this chapter, 3 topics will be addressed. 1, the nature of complexity. 2, the question of whether complexity is a continuum or is characterized by discrete stages. And 3, major views on the emergence of complex societies. The discussion that follows will be necessarily selective, focusing on those aspects of the evolution of complexity that are relevant to understanding collapse. Nature of complexity. Complexity is generally understood to refer to such things as the size of a society, the number and distinctiveness of its parts, the variety of specialized social roles that it incorporates, the number of distinct social personalities present, and the variety of mechanisms for organizing these into a coherent, functioning whole. Augmenting any of these dimensions increases the complexity of a society. Hunter-gatherer societies, by way of illustrating one contrasting complexity, contain no more than a few dozen distinct social personalities, while modern European censuses recognize 10,000 to 20,000 unique occupational roles, and industrial societies may contain overall more than 1 million different kinds of social personalities. 2 concepts important to understanding the nature of complexity are inequality and heterogeneity. Inequality may be thought of as vertical differentiation, ranking, or unequal access to material and social resources. Heterogeneity is a subtler concept. It refers to the number of distinctive parts or components to a society, and at the same time to the ways in which a population is distributed among these parts. A population that is divided equally among the occupations and roles of a society is homogeneously distributed. The converse brings increasing heterogeneity and complexity. A society with a great deal of heterogeneity, then, is one that is complex. Inequality and heterogeneity are interrelated, but in part respond to different processes and are not always positively correlated in sociopolitical evolution. In early civilizations, for example, inequality tended to be initially high and heterogeneity low. Through time, inequality decreased and heterogeneity grew as multiple hierarchies would develop. Johnson relates this process to growth in the amount of information that must be processed by a society, with greater quantity and variety of information requiring greater social complexity. Complex societies tend to be what Simon has called nearly decomposable systems. That is, they are at least partly built up of social units that are themselves potentially stable and independent, and indeed at one time may have been so. Thus, a newly established state may include several formerly independent villages or ethnic groups, or an empire may incorporate previously established states. To the extent that these states, ethnic groups, or villages retain the potential for independence and stability, the collapse process may result in reversion, decomposition to these building blocks of complexity. Simpler societies. The citizens of modern complex societies usually do not realize that we are an anomaly in history. Throughout the several million years that recognizable humans are known to have lived, the common political unit was the small autonomous community acting independently and largely self-sufficient. Robert Carnero has estimated that 99.8% of human history has been dominated by these autonomous local communities. It has only been within the last 6,000 years that something unusual has emerged: the hierarchical, organized, independent states that are the major reference for our contemporary political experience. Complex societies, once established, tend to expand and dominate, so that today they control most of the Earth's lands and people, and are perpetually vexed by those still beyond their reach. A dilemma arises from this. We today are familiar mainly with political forms that are an oddity of history. We think of these as normal, and we view as alien the majority of the human experience. It is little surprise that collapse is viewed so fearfully. The small, acephalous communities that have dominated our history were not homogeneous. The degree of variation among such societies is substantial. Although these societies would be characterized, in comparison to ourselves, as simple, nevertheless they display variations in size, complexity, ranking, economic differentiation, and other factors. It is from this variation that many of our theories of cultural evolution have been developed. Simpler societies are, of course, comparatively smaller. They number from a handful to a few thousand persons who are united within socio-political units encompassing correspondingly small territories. Such societies tend to be organized on the basis of kinship, with status familial and centered on the individual. One can know most everyone in such a society and can categorize each person individually in terms of position and distance in a web of kin relationships. Leadership in the simplest societies tends to be minimal. It is personal and charismatic and exists only for special purposes. Hierarchical control is not institutionalized, but is limited to definite spheres of activity at specific times and rests substantially on persuasion. Solons has captured the essence of petty chieftainship in these societies. The holder of such a position is a spokesman, a master of ceremonies, with otherwise little influence, few functions, and no privileges or coercive power. One such word from a leader, notes Solons, and everyone does as he pleases. Equality in these societies lies in direct individual access to the resources that sustain life, in mobility and the option to simply withdraw from an untenable social situation, and in conventions that prevent economic accumulation and impose sharing. Leaders, where they exist, are constrained from exercising authority, amassing wealth, or acquiring excessive prestige. Where there are differences in control of economic resources, these must be exercised generously. Personal political ambition is either restrained from expression or channeled to fulfill a public good. The route to an elevated social position is to acquire a surplus of subsistence resources and to distribute these in such a way that one establishes prestige in the community and creates a following and a faction. Where several ambitious individuals follow this course, there is constant competition and jockeying for position. The result is an unstable, fluctuating political environment in which ephemeral leaders rise and fall, in which the death of a leader brings the demise of his faction and wholesale political regrouping. Native Melanesians often refer to such an ambitious individual as a big man, a term that has achieved anthropological currency. A big man strives to build a following, but is never permanently successful. Since his influence is limited to his faction, extending that influence means extending the size of the following. At the same time, the loyalty of his existing followers must be constantly renewed through generosity. Herein lies a tension. As resources are allocated to expanding a faction, those available to retain previous loyalties must decline. As a big man attempts to expand his sphere of influence, he is likely to lose the springboard that made this possible. Big man systems contain thus a built-in structural limitation on their scope, extent, and durability. Other simple societies are organized at higher levels of political differentiation. There are true permanent positions of rank in which authority resides in an office rather than an individual, and to which inhere genuine powers of command. Chiefly rank is often hereditary or nearly so. Inequality pervades such societies, which tend to be larger and more densely populated, to a degree coordinate with their increased complexity. In these centrally focused, chiefly societies, political organization extends beyond the community level. Accordingly, economic, political, and ceremonial life transcend petty political concerns. I will have more from Tainter on tomorrow's show. Diversity. Of course, it's the war of all against all. I'm looking at a picture of a woman called Virginia Bremer, who, despite her name, is a Filipina woman, and she is wearing a button that says "Vote for Virginia Bremer," and another button of equal size that has the Liberal logo at the bottom. These are both red and white, the Liberal colors, the Canadian colors. Yes, Canada's flag was based on the logo of the Liberal Party of Canada. How convenient. The second button says double vaxxed. Well, good for you, sweetie. This is from Ben Majur, who is described as a multi-skilled journalist, CTV News Vancouver. It actually says that. That's almost as good as professionally serious person. Elections can be won or lost on the doorstep, and that's why Vancouver Kingsway Liberal candidate Virginia Bremer, a political newcomer, has been out pounding the pavement to connect with potential voters. Yes, everybody knows this. That is a very weak lead. For anyone out there who's ever felt that they didn't belong, that they didn't matter, that their voices have not been heard, I want to be able to be that voice to represent them in Ottawa, she said in an interview with CTV News. Yes, she's the rebel within the Liberal Party, a rebel who was handpicked. She didn't have to run. She was handpicked as a candidate, presumably because she is a twofer. She has her work cut out for her as she tries to unseat NDP incumbent Don Davies, who has won 4 straight federal races and represented Vancouver Kingsway since 2008. According to census data, the riding is one of the most ethnically diverse in the country, with more than half the population made up of immigrants to Canada. There have been ridings recently in Canada where 90% or more of the people in the riding are immigrants. These places aren't Canada. They are something else. Bremer, who was born in the Philippines and moved to Canada when she was 7, okay, she's more than a twofer. She's a threefer. She's a woman, she's an ethnic minority, and she's an immigrant. Bing, bing, bing. She grew up in the riding, but now lives in a neighboring one. In a recent interview with the Georgia Straight, Davis said there's an element of opportunism to Bremer's candidacy, accusing her of constituency shopping and disputing that her acclamation by the Liberals represents genuine inclusion. His Liberal opponent found the comments insulting. When I heard it, I was actually really shocked and taken aback, and I personally thought that I'd heard wrong, said Bremer, who is trying to become the first Filipina elected to Parliament. Yes, he has apologized. She has not accepted his apology. He pointed out, quite rightfully, that this woman does not live in her riding. Somehow this became problematic. Misogynist, perhaps. Misogynoir. So this is what Don Davies MP said. Ms. Bremer, I have the utmost respect for your lived experience as a racialized woman and proud member of the Filipino community. I'm grateful for the opportunity to represent this incredible multicultural riding and cherish the full participation and inclusion of everyone in politics. However, my comments in this article did not reflect that, and I offer my sincere apology for the hurt this caused. I'm looking forward to debating our ideas on the campaign trail and delivering for people in Vancouver Kingsway. Sincerely, Don Davies. In many ridings in Greater Vancouver, it's almost got to the point where white stooges like Don Davies will no longer be acceptable or needed. The Liberals have, for decades, they've run white people, mostly white men, so that they can appeal to different kinds of ethnic minorities. But in certain writings, the number of Sikhs, say, or Chinese has risen to the point where, no, this is going to be represented by a Sikh person forever or a Chinese person forever. And I suppose soon enough, we'll have writings that are represented by Filipinos forever und so weiter. You know, they run parallel campaigns, and the central office doesn't know what's going on because they prepare all these materials, which are written in native languages like Tagalog, and they often end up saying things which are not party policy, particularly that the wishes of this particular ethnic group will be granted by the party. And often you get the amusing spectacle of political debates going on in languages which the vast majority of Canadians do not understand, but I guess it's not our country anymore. And let's talk about nationalization. Doug Ford, Canada's extreme right premier. Apparently, I've read this and I've never seen it disputed, that McKinsey is directing it's Doug Ford's COVID-19 response. This is a regulation that was filed secretly, and thanks to Metal Mike for this. I don't think the media has made anything of it. Ontario Regulation 577/21, made under the Reopening Ontario, a flexible response to COVID-19 Act 2020. This just makes me grind my teeth. Bills used to be called, C-22 or whatever, or in the United States, they would be named after the people sponsoring them. Now they have to have these cutesy election slogan names. What's the federal takeover of voting in the United States is named after that black congressman who died a couple of years ago, who we're all supposed to know and love. And, well, if you don't agree with this, then you are trampling on the sacred memory of John, what's his name? So this was filed 2 days ago. The person responsible for a business or organization that is open shall operate the business or organization in compliance with any advice, recommendations, and instructions issued by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health or by a medical officer of health after consultation with the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. A, requiring the business or organization to establish, implement, and ensure compliance with a COVID-19 vaccination policy, or B, setting out the precautions and procedures that the business or organization must include in its COVID-19 vaccination policy. Medical Officer of Health means a medical officer of health is defined in subsection 1.1 of the Health Protection and Promotion Act. Section 2 is amended by adding the following subsections. The person responsible for a business or organization that is open shall operate the business or organization in compliance with any advice, recommendations, or instructions issued by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health or by a medical officer of health after consultation with the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. This regulation comes into force on the day that it is filed. So super right-wing Doug Ford has, in effect, nationalized all the businesses in Ontario. Note this word advice and recommendations. It says advice, recommendations, and instructions. This is wide-ranging power, unbelievable wide-ranging power. So by law, they must, private businesses must accept any advice given by a medical officer of health. Any advice. Oh, no, we don't need to give you instructions. We just need to give you advice or recommendations, and it is the law. And if you break the law, you are going to be in serious trouble. You might not have a business anymore. Yes. What? This is from Carl Schwitzer. I'm laughing because the government says something and the media reports it as so, and then we learn, wait a minute, not so fast. Carl Schwitzer at American Thinker. You may have heard that the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 shot received FDA approval this past Monday. Politicians, national health officials, and journalists are breathless with excitement about how this approval will finally induce the remaining vaccine hesitant into stepping forward to receive the jab. The FDA even has a press release on its website about it. There's just one problem. If you read the actual letters that the FDA sent to Pfizer on August 23rd, you'll see that the FDA did no such thing. In the sense that the term FDA approval is generally understood, this drug is not approved by the FDA. It is still under emergency use authorization. It is still an experimental drug. The FDA sent two letters. The first one was a letter of biologics license application approval, and the second was a letter of EU extension to Comirnaty, which is now what they're calling the jab. The BLA approval letter approves Pfizer's application for a license to label its COVID-19 drug with the brand name Comirnaty. This letter also spells out the terms and requirements for 9 additional clinical trials over 5 years and yearly status reports to study the acknowledged occurrences of myocarditis and pericarditis that have followed the administering of the Pfizer shots. This license to label and manufacture is not a full approval of the drug, which clearly is still subject to many years of clinical trials. The EUA extension letter extends the term of the EUA for the current drug and authorizes the experimental use of the brand name drug Comirnaty. The mRNA gene therapy shots are still experimental. Mandating them is wrong by a wide variety of ethical standards. Dr. Meryl Nass found the truths that the FDA buried in the blather of these letters and offers a theory about why it was done this way. The drug manufacturers were granted immunity from liability for the drugs produced under the EUAs. The granting of the license reapplies the customary liability for injury and death caused by the product. Pfizer, the health officials, and the politicians get to take a fictitious victory lap for the approval, while Pfizer-BioNTech continues to stealthily enjoy immunity from product liability because there are many millions of the unlicensed doses on the shelves and in the manufacturing pipeline that will be administered first. The licensed version will not arrive on shelves or be jabbed into arms for many months to come. Sorry about that. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Federal regulators are likely to approve a COVID-19 booster shot for vaccinated adults starting at least 6 months after the previous dose, rather than the 8-month gap they previously announced, a person familiar with the plan said, as the Biden administration steps up preparations for delivering boosters to the public. These are not, just in the same way that the mRNA jabs are not vaccines, as vaccines have been traditionally understood, these boosters are not boosters, as boosters are traditionally understood. It's just another dose of the same jab. But the media is immune to these sort of distinctions. This is from childrenshealthdefense.org. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has written a book called The Real Anthony Fauci. And it sounds very interesting. The research I conducted for my new book exposes how Fauci's gargantuan yearly disbursements, $6.1 billion, allow him to dictate the subject, content, and outcome of scientific health research across the globe. These annual disbursements, hang on, I have to close this. These annual disbursements also allow Fauci to exercise dictatorial control over the army of knowledge and innovation leaders who populate the so-called independent federal panels that approve and mandate drugs and vaccines, including the committees that allowed the emergency use authorization of COVID-19 vaccines. Fauci uses the financial clout at his disposal to wield extraordinary influence over hospitals, universities, journals, and thousands of influential doctors and scientists whose careers and institutions he has the power to ruin, advance, or reward. These are the same doctors who appear on network news shows, publish on the op-ed pages of influential media, and craft and defend the pharmaceutical cartels' official narratives. A couple of years ago, I think it was, I reviewed on the old book club with Luke Ford a book called Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, published by Macmillan, which I highly commend to you. He describes in great detail how most of what you think you know about government approval of drugs is wrong, because the work is done by the drug companies themselves, and the drug companies forward this work to governments, which pretty much say, well, we can see you've gone to a lot of trouble there, so rubber stamp. The governments do not do their own independent reviews of the efficacy or safety of drugs. They don't do that. They farmed it out. No pun intended. So the word is beginning to get out that something is going wrong. This is from Julie Steenhuisen at Reuters. Some 25% of SARS-CoV-2 infections among Los Angeles County residents occurred in fully vaccinated residents from May through July 25th, a period that includes the impact of the highly transmissible Delta variant. Delta variant, U.S. officials reported Tuesday. And of course, that number is only going to rise. I spoke about an article by Dr. Thomas Seiler from American Thinker. The good news about COVID-19, he has a follow-up today called The Bad and the Ugly about COVID in America. The mainstream media, some public health authorities, and the pharmaceutical industry have engaged in a massive disinformation campaign. This campaign is focused on using fear to get everyone to take an experimental vaccine as the only way to get out of the pandemic. On Sunday, President Biden urged America's employers to make vaccination a condition of employment and expressed hope that all Americans would be vaccinated. Why? What if the agenda of vaccinating everyone is not medically necessary? The bad. One, the COVID-19 death count has been artificially elevated to maximize fear. California's fifth most populous county revised its COVID-19 death count down by 22% after reviewing the cases for the last 18 months. Two, the PCR test for COVID-19 is flawed in many ways and led to overcounting cases. 2 weeks ago, the CDC and FDA quietly said they would abandon the PCR test for COVID-19 in December 2021, acknowledging it did not work. The CDC and FDA also admit they did not have any physical samples of the COVID-19 virus, so they used common cold viruses and human cells to make a less accurate test. COVID-19 testing has been inaccurate and ramped up cases for fear. Three, the new mRNA vaccines are far from safe. While the VAERS reporting system now has over 10,000 deaths, 20,000 in the European Union after the vaccine, a whistleblower with the CDC says the actual count is closer to 50,000. Four, the mRNA vaccine is not safe in pregnant women. Five, the most prestigious medical journals have been part of the disinformation. The Lancet had to retract a study saying that hydroxychloroquine was not working on COVID-19 when it was proved that there was no data for the study. The Lancet also published a statement signed by several scientists saying the COVID-19 virus could not possibly have come from the Wuhan lab. Antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE, may be happening. One initial concern about making a coronavirus vaccine was ADE. Now reports are beginning to come in from countries that are heavily vaccinated, such as Israel, that vaccinated people are getting sick and may have more serious illnesses than those not vaccinated. If the death rate of the vaccinated is higher than the unvaccinated, this would be very scary. The mRNA vaccines are not 95% effective as touted. Efficacy is likely closer to 40 to 70%, but more data is needed. And let's now go to Daily Skeptic, aka Lockdown Skeptics, from the latest from the United Kingdom. Parents demand final say over whether children get COVID jab. Well, parents cannot demand the final say, apparently now, as to the sex of their children, because the schools will decide, backed up by the government, that your 10-year-old girl is now a boy and you're not allowed to know about it. So I don't expect much in the way of stopping vaccines. Handful of countries added to the travel green list. Hamburg businesses to be given choice to bar unvaccinated residents. Fewer cars produced last month by British factories than in any July since 1956. Does population density explain COVID-19 death rates in Europe? And we will go, as always, to wrap this up, to Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. No, he's still alive on Twitter. We talked about the Israeli preprint yesterday. Okay. Berenson says, stop talking about impeachment or the 25th Amendment. The Democrats did this for 4 years and the consequences were terrible. If Biden must be reined in, the date that matters is 11/8/22. We are bigger than one president, no matter how feckless or incompetent. You think the Taliban couldn't have stopped this? This is their parting gift to us, and they know Uncle Joe won't do a thing. Well, he's talking a lot about Afghanistan. Awful a lot about Afghanistan. Where is this from? White House to media. We want our props on Afghanistan. Berenson responds, such unthinkable arrogance, such unthinkable denial. And you trust them about vaccines and your kids. You trust them about boosters. You trust them about anything. Oh, and he has some movie suggestions. Hot vaxxed summer, hotter vaxxed fall, smoking hot vaxxed winters. And Monica Gandhi, MD, PhD, had made a statement, and U.S. at this point needs to consider immunity rather than vax passports. Berenson comments from one of the only academic physicians, COVID experts, who is truly middle of the road. From the Times, the London Times, COVID in Scotland, circuit breaker lockdown among options to curb surge in cases. Berenson comments, if we could just get vaccination rates a little higher, everything would be cool. Clay Travis had tweeted, Titans quarterback Ryan Tannehill, who is double vaccinated, tested positive for COVID and is now out a substantial number of days. The NFL COVID policy was predicated on breakthrough cases not existing after vaccination. It's broken. Huge mess for the season coming. Berenson comments, no blood clots or myocarditis, though, so that's a win. Oh, the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad tweeted, in addition to the 5.5 million doses of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine delivered to Pakistan, the United States is delivering a third tranche of 3.7 million Pfizer doses as part of our ongoing solidarity with the people of Pakistan as they recover from this devastating pandemic. Berenson comments, fantastic. Let's send even more and make sure the Talibs get them too. Can't be too careful. And I'm going to move on to Theater Thursday. I just have to open some tabs here. And the movie that I'm talking about comes from 1945, and it is called They Were Expendable. Before I do, I am going to go to the chat. There we go. Don Willis says, now she and Biden are the most popular wanted in the highest office. Crazy coup right in front of our eyes. Oscar Toe says, Capitol Police, only non-racist cops in the U.S. Don Willis again, social media scoring is already a thing. China has nothing on us. Chokukin 666. Our entire culture and all institutions are apparently post-structuralist. This is beyond parody. Brandon Smith says, China at least does it overtly. And what is the latest in the chat? Tucker is kibitzing with Glenn Greenwald, says Red Sulfur. It's interesting that the Biden candidacy, well, let's say the impeachment effort against Trump, the Biden candidacy, the Biden presidency is pushed all of these people thought to be on the left, towards the middle or even to the right. Michael Tracy being one example, Glenn Greenwald being another, Alex Berenson being another still. It's good to know that there are some people around who have a limit beyond which they cannot be pushed. Red Sulphur says, to her credit, she wasn't straddling a Viet Cong cannon. That's a reference to Jane Fonda. I see Kamala Harris put flowers in what she thought was a memorial for McCain in Vietnam, says Chogokin666. The one show I stick around for a while, and Kevin ignores chat, says Jonathan Ferguson. Well, I go back to the chat typically about every 15 minutes. One Eye Moon, that's a new name. Kamala should, yeah, okay, I'm not going to repeat that. Not going to repeat that. Okay. Red Devil's Advocates, would you rather the earth dies and humans survive, or vice versa? You asked that question before. Someone else asked that question before. Human life is impossible except on Earth, so I think that's an answer to the question. All this talk about Mars, it's fantasy. Let's talk about energy. Let's talk about the energy needed to get people to Mars, okay, alive. Because they're not going to be able to come back. How would they come back? So how much oxygen are they going to bring with them? Are they going to bring with them the means to create oxygen on Mars? What kind of structure are they going to build to keep the cold and the non-oxygen out? What are they going to eat? Are they going to bring the tools to construct, the water flow, sanitation, and such like that they would need? No, it's a complete non-starter. David Wright says, come to find out that this was the Grace Servants Room all along. Okay. Hopcastle 88 said, I don't mind the hotel room. Yes, the bedspreads are hideous, but there's nothing I can do about that. Not for the time being. And so let's talk about They Were Expendable, which is not a movie that you hear very much in the discovery or in discussions of John Ford. I've reviewed some of John Ford's films previously on Theater Thursday. John Ford, his given name was John Martin Feeney. Ford is an Irish name, of course. Perhaps he thought that Feeney was too Irish or too comically Irish, like McGillicuddy or McFeely. Anyway, he was born in 1894 to Irish immigrants who had arrived not that long before. If you look at John Ford's career, he was very intent on proving that Irish were real Americans. Because, of course, for the longest time, there were a great many Americans who believed that the Irish were not Americans and could not be Americans. And a theme that you see in many of John Ford's movies, in his Westerns, as well as his war movies, that Irish paid for their American citizenship with blood. And, of course, you see this in They Were Expendable as well. John Ford, when he testified before Congress, he introduced himself by saying, I make Westerns. Of course, he made a lot more than Westerns. He made, for instance, a film about the IRA, The Informer, in 1935, for which he won Best Director. He made The Grapes of Wrath in 1940, for which he won Best Director, Grapes of Wrath. Well, it's set in the West, but it's not a Western. He made How Green Was My Valley, for which he won Best Director in 1941, which is about Wales. So he was more versatile than a lot of people believe. There are certain things which are common to John Ford films. John Ford believed a lot in community. And so in a great many of his films, you will see the traditions, the expressions of community, even in, well, places, even in godforsaken, naval operation in the Philippines, or you see it out in a U.S. Army outpost, in the 1870s, that there's a temptation in far-flung places like that to allow civilization to devolve. Well, Ford is having none of it. You see a lot of dancing, formal dancing in John Ford films, because that's what civilized people do. This is what communal people do. They dress up and they get together and they dance. They do their traditional dances. You typically see a lot of drinking in John Ford films as well. There's typically a wild bar scene. We get kind of a wild bar scene in this film. Near the end of the film, we see a man who is not going, an American, who is not going to leave the Philippines, and he has his gun, and he has his pot of whiskey, and he has the shack that he built, and he's not going. Got his gun, he's got his whiskey, he's got his courage. Well, that's all any man needs. There is religious expression in John Ford's films. There is some Catholic expression in this film. Ford was a Catholic, and you could say to a certain extent that he promoted it in his films. I've argued before that it's possible to make the argument that Hollywood was, to a large extent, a Catholic foundation. You look at Ford, you look at Alfred Hitchcock, you look at Leo McCarey, you look at Frank Capra, to give 4 examples. Before Hollywood got respectable, to the extent that it is respectable, it was dominated by Jews and Catholics for the reason that it was not respectable. And so Jews and Catholics were, to a certain extent, discriminated against in the United States. And so many of them flocked to Hollywood because there was a lot of opportunity there. Another thing that you see in John Ford movies is John Wayne. I believe that John Wayne appeared in something like 12 of John Ford's movies. That John Ford made John Wayne a star with Stagecoach in 1939. And you read a lot of things about John Ford, that he didn't have a high respect for John Wayne, that he was terrible to him on set. And I suppose this is true. But the fact that he worked with him over and over again suggests the high regard that he had for him. There's a story about Ford seeing John Wayne in a different movie, I don't know, Rio Bravo, something like that perhaps, where he's supposed to have said, "I didn't know the son of a bitch could act." John Wayne had been an extra in Hollywood, for a decade or something like this. But after Stagecoach, he was at the top, and he stayed on top. John Wayne stayed on top for a long, long time. John Wayne became kind of avatar of America. I see that the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts will remove an exhibit dedicated to John Wayne, as the late actor's past bigoted remarks have come under increased scrutiny. Conversations about systemic racism in our cultural institutions, along with the recent global civil uprising, is that what it was, by the Black Lives Matter movement, require that we consider the role our school can play as a change maker in promoting anti-racist cultural values and experiences. Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion Evan Hughes said in a Friday announcement to the film school community. What a creep. Evan Hughes, I'm not looking at a picture of Evan Hughes. That sounds like a very white name to me. They Were Expendable is about PT boats, about the origin of the use of so-called motor torpedo boat squadrons in World War II. And it's a strange movie in that it came out in late 1945, which is, of course, the year that the war ended, and just a few months after the surrender of the Japanese in September of that year. But it is about a defeat, perhaps the greatest defeat in American military history, which is the Japanese conquest of the Philippines, which led to the Bataan Death March, the imprisoning under dreadful conditions of tens of thousands of American soldiers, and the fleeing of General Douglas MacArthur to Australia. This movie, which is filmed in black and white, I have to say, you get it from Warner Archive. It looks tremendous. It has been restored, and apparently it was in not good condition. Now it looks great, absolutely great. And one must commend the cinematography of Joseph August. Robert Montgomery is the first build, and he had a successful war career in World War II. He ended up as a lieutenant commander. He is a very likable, determined fellow in this. Perhaps it was wartime experience that gave him the ability to, impersonate a naval officer. Of course, John Wayne does very well as well. And John Wayne did not serve in World War II. He was deeply ashamed of this for the rest of his life, and it's been speculated that one of the reasons that he became a super patriot, why he appeared in so many military roles, was to make up for the fact that he'd never served. Now, many people have ascribed this to cowardice, but it would appear that the story is much more complicated than that he wanted to serve, but that his company, Republic Pictures, refused to let him out of his contract, and that his wife, who was on the outs with, divorced, she got a letter. Wayne had asked to join the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, and the OSS had said yes, and the letter was delivered to his ex-wife, who destroyed it or forgot about it. You note, if you watch the credits of this film, the rankings in real life are shown. For instance, Robert Montgomery is credited as Robert Montgomery, Commander, United States Naval Reserve. And John Ford risked his life filming for the United States Armed Forces during World War II. And when I say he risked his life, I'm not exaggerating, not in the slightest. John Ford loved the military, as you can see in this film. Ford was the head of the photographic unit for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. He was at Omaha Beach on D-Day, and he was promoted to Rear Admiral in the United States Naval Reserve. They Were Expendable begins with a maneuver by PT boats. And this is done for an admiral in order to persuade him that these PT boats could be useful to the American war effort. Of course, there was no war at the time. This film begins a day or two before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And these are small boats made of wood, and they're rather lightly armed, but they can fire torpedoes. And beautiful photography as you see the boats crisscrossing in the water. The admiral is impressed, but he doesn't think that these boats are going to be of much use. John Wayne wants out. He has been sort of an acolyte. He plays Lieutenant Rusty Ryan, Lieutenant J.G. Robert Montgomery plays Lieutenant John Brickley. They call him Brick. And he has been following in his wake, as it were, no pun intended. And Montgomery, or Brick, let's call him Brick, had promised him, his own command. And what kind of command is this? Well, you're going to command your own PT boat. And John Wayne, or Rusty, is not much impressed by this. And he draws up a request for a transfer to a destroyer. And I really have to praise Robert Montgomery's performance in this, because it is very restrained, but you can see how passionate a man he is. But he manages to contain his passion, except in one scene, a funny scene. John Ford's films, no matter how violent or tragic they may be, always have comedic scenes in them. Their station has been destroyed, and their mission, to the extent that they had one, has been reduced to almost nothing. And on the way out, Rusty kicks a can as violently as he can, and Brick yells at him, "Does that help?" And Rusty said, "Yes." So Brick, who is just as upset as Rusty, he kicks a can too, as hard as he can. So Pearl Harbor, there is a formal dance, and they're saying goodbye. They're saying goodbye to the cook who has served them so loyally, the Navy so loyally. And a radio announcer comes on to say that Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Well, they don't want to hear that because it's interfering with the music. They turn it off, and they find out later what has happened at Pearl Harbor. And so, what's in it for us? America's at war with Japan, and both Brick and Rusty, they want to see action. And they are initially informed that, we don't think these boats are useful, so you're going to run messages, essentially, and patrol duty. And they don't think that that's the way that, that fighting sailors should. That's not the position they should be put in, because it's not fighting, is it? It's not war as they know it. Eventually, they're given an opportunity to prove the worth of the PT boats. Two of them are sent on what is essentially a suicide mission. They demonstrate the value. One boat returns. I mentioned the anomaly of this movie being about a defeat, a disastrous defeat for the United States. But it is also about, the cost of war, and particularly the cost of being in a PT boat squadron. Because throughout this movie, and it's not overplayed, we see the number of the boats and the number of the sailors manning those boats whittled and whittled and whittled down relentlessly, as it was in real life. This book is very close to the truth, and expert military advice was given. Now, when I talk about realism, sailors are famous for their foul language. There's not any of that in this movie, because you couldn't have that sort of thing in movies at the time. I suppose sailors are rather more louche in real life than they are in, they were expendable. So in a certain sense, this is an idealized version of the Navy. But one gets tired of gritty realism, and idealism comes as a nice change of pace. The film was filmed in Florida, and pretty much right off the bat, we see our little armada of PT boats being attacked by Zeros, by Japanese Zeros, and it is an absolutely thrilling scene to see machine guns, heavy machine guns, fighting with these planes as the bombs are going off all over them, and as John Wayne gets his hand shot up by a bullet from a plane and develops blood poisoning. And this leads to him not being able to command a boat in the first significant action, which leads to a romantic subplot starring Donna Reed. You know, I grew up with Donna Reed as the mother matriarch, if you will, in the popular Donna Reed show of the 50s and 60s. And it's always a shock, even to this day, to go back and look at her movies and just to recognize how attractive she was. Well, to put it blunt, just how sexy a woman she was. And certainly she is so in this movie. She plays a nurse who has John Wayne as a particularly difficult patient, and she's not putting up with it. And Rusty makes a fuss about how he's not attracted to women wearing potato sacks, you know, the jumpsuits brown jumpsuits that they wore, but he clearly is taken in by this woman. I won't spoil it for you, but you know, if you haven't seen the movie, you'll probably be surprised at how it plays out, how the romantic subplot plays out. We have a little dinner hosted solely for Donna Reed, where there's I think 6 sailors, and they're all sitting around the table, and they are all so formal and gracious. That's what you see in John Ford films. You see chivalrous men and gracious women. And these sailors are just absolutely delighted to have a woman's company for a couple of hours. And a bunch of them, including old John Ford stalwart Ward Bond, are underneath the floor, and they're singing songs. As I mentioned, John Ford likes community and community singing. You get a lot of that in his films. It's a very charming film. So there is one of the most famous incidents of the war in the Pacific was the removal of Douglas MacArthur to Australia, and a very perilous journey it was. And he was taken on a journey of about 700 miles at night by a PT boat. And our heroes are delegated to this journey, which is going to separate them from the rest. We actually see Douglas MacArthur. Interesting that there is a very significant historical deviation. At the end of the movie, they say, Douglas MacArthur, we will return. That's not what MacArthur said. He said, I will return. And when he did, he famously said on the beach, I have returned. And various people in the military, and including President Roosevelt, were infuriated by this. You know, does Douglas MacArthur think he is the United States Army? Well, maybe he did. But Douglas MacArthur, whose father had been the governor of the Philippines, Doug had a very close relationship with the Filipino people. And he said this because this was his personal promise to them, that he would not forget them. And they did not forget him either. For decades after MacArthur left the army, when the Filipino troops would muster at the beginning of the day, someone would yell out, Douglas MacArthur, and someone would reply, present in spirit, sir. That's how much they loved Doug MacArthur. So at this point, it's clear that there's not much life left in their squadron, and the disaster in the Philippines is unfolding fast. And so a decision has to be made: who is going to be saved and who is going to be spared. And an admiral in the film, and Charles Trowbridge plays him. Very noble character, and again, very believable as a military man. One can imagine, looking at a man like that, why you would be willing to risk your life and to follow orders. And expendable, you know what that means. And the admiral uses a baseball metaphor. When you're told to bunt, you bunt, and you leave the home runs for others. And this is essentially the role of the PT boats in the movie, that they are bunters, that they are, expendable. And there has been this tension throughout the movie with John Wayne's character, Rusty Ryan, about, his desires of glory and of his loyalty to his unit and to the Navy. And he's constantly having to be reminded by Brick, whose side are you on? And it's really quite touching, the rather father and son relationship that Brick and Ryan have. I mentioned Ward Bond. Cameron Mitchell is in this film. He's barely recognizable. Marshall Thompson, who later starred in Daktari, he plays a gawky ensign. He's barely recognizable as well. I suppose it's a good thing in movies such as this, that if you're portraying young men, to actually cast young men, and not men in their 30s or 40s. The film also has a ship's cat, and I love ship's cats. This is it's quite a moving film. It's not over the top. It's not bombastic in any way, although there's a lot of patriotic music employed. The title says it all. They were expendable. We hear a lot about heroes in wars. We don't hear a lot about those people who, died, not particularly heroically, but just in the course of doing their duty. And that's what this film is about. It's not like 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Peck, which came out 4 years later, which I've praised to the skies, quite rightfully, which is it's a psychological examination of the strains of leadership. This is They Were Expendable, as the title would indicate, is more quotidian. I'm not going to say that one film is better than the other, but I really think this is one of John Ford's best films, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. Now that it is on Blu-ray via Warner Archive, sadly, no extras. Perhaps its reputation will improve. But John Ford made so very many films that one can watch a couple of dozen of them, and you've only really rather scratched the surface. People complain about the humor in his in films, the slapstick scenes and such like. There is less of this in this film than in others, including The Searchers, which a great many consider to be John Ford's best and deepest film. But no, this movie is top drawer all the way, and I can just imagine, at the time it came out and for some time afterwards, that the initial reaction of so many young men who watched it was that they wanted to join the United States Navy. It's a frankly patriotic film. There's no ambiguity in that regard, and I can take the ambiguity, but I like the straightforward patriotism as well. Let's take a final look at the chat. Media Hits says the Black British film director Steve McQueen has two good movies. One is Hunger, about IRA hunger striking and rioting in a British prison. Anna says, I liked Cincinnati Kid, but McQueen seemed to sleepwalk through most of it. Also, shame about a sex addict roaming around NYC. Ugh. Yikes. Media Hit says, I found the Steve McQueen movie Bullet on DVD for 50 cents this week. You know, I saw Bullet when I was a kid, and I was quite thrilled by it because it's a thrilling movie. But deplorably, it invented a movie cliche, which you can't get rid of. That when you get hit with a shotgun, you get blown backwards. You might even get blown, 5-6 feet into a wall. That is not what happens at all. You get hit with a shotgun blast, you crumple and fall down. But it looks cool when someone starts flying backwards and hits a wall. But when I resaw Bullet as an adult, I was struck. I suppose the French New Wave influence on it, how spare it is. Not a lot of dialogue in that movie. Not a lot of exposition as well. I think that's one of the things that makes it so good. Will they were expected to be on Best of the Worst? Come. I've heard that Pilleux was unnecessary, but was done because of MacArthur's vanity or foolishness. Compare the casualty and KIA figures for the troops in the South Pacific versus the troops in Europe. The traditional strategy would have been just to take this island and take that island and take that island. The war probably would have lasted another 2 years if that had happened. MacArthur decided to employ the air superiority that the United States has in order to leapfrog, which was to travel vast distances ahead to the north, which was a kind of naval version of the Blitzkrieg. And it greatly shortened the war and saved the lives of, I suppose you could say, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Let's see. Media Hit says, my mom met Don Knotts' ex-wife. She claims he was verbally abusive to her. Oh, dear. Don Knotts, that is a strange career. He was on the Andy Griffith Show. Worst deputy ever. Just so incompetent. Andy Griffith on that show is very, kindly man. You'd have to be very kindly indeed to put up with a bungler like a Don Knotts' character. And then he was on, Three's Company, replacing Norman Fell and his wife as the landlord, a swinger, supposedly. You've ever seen that guy's mug? He's one of the ugliest people ever to be on television or the movies. It's just completely obnoxious. And then he was on Matlock as his old buddy or whatever. And again, just, of course, they had this other guy, Warren Frost, who played the patrician Wasp, Susan's father on Seinfeld, playing just a stupid, boring bungler. Interesting choices. Cannot respect his conduct in response to the bonus army, says Chogokin 666. Well, Roosevelt gave him his orders and he followed them. Let's see. Filipino trad folk music sounds very Latin. Could MacArthur have become an American Caesar if he tried? I don't know. I've reviewed William Manchester's book, American Caesar. Either MacArthur was given very bad advice about his, presidential chances in 1948 or, 1952, or he just wasn't all that interested in it. And I really look to the latter, because he was a fighting soldier. Eisenhower, of course, Eisenhower had been MacArthur's chief of staff. Eisenhower was an organization man. That's not to denigrate Eisenhower, because he was excellent at that, unlike the bunglers at the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. But Eisenhower was well suited to be president because he was primarily engaged in management in his career. Let's say Don Willis, when men were men, working hard, battling the world, and the Queen would stay home and bathe the kids. Yes, not a lot of diversity in They Were Expendable. We have some Filipinos who are, well, there's a singer, Filipino singer, and servants for the officers. We have a black man playing a piano in the officers' club, and there are 3 female nurses, and that's it. But of course, there was a movie called Pearl Harbor, released, how many years ago? And it starred Ben Affleck, and I'm thinking Ben Affleck would look completely out of place in They Were Expendable. There's just a seriousness in these men's faces, in their attitudes that I suppose later generations simply can't understand it, and they can't mimic it. Actors, that is. Do I have anything else in the chat? I found his acting lazy at times. It is hard to explain, though he certainly wasn't lazy about always trying to draw attention to himself when he wasn't the main focus of a scene. We're talking about Steve McQueen here, obviously. Yes, Yul Brynner was absolutely infuriated by this on the set of The Magnificent Seven. Donna Willis says Donna Reed was hot. Indeed, she was. But you see, she has this really, passionate face. I don't know how intelligent she was, but there are some actors who can play intelligent, and there are many others that can't. And she plays intelligent really well. Really well. As you see in the movie that everyone loves the best now, although it was flop for the longest time, It's a Wonderful Life. You watch her in that, and such a pretty, clever woman. Is such a passionate woman as well. I mean, at least on screen. I can't speak to real life. Okay. I think that's it. Do we have anything else here? Sand Pebbles was a big influence for me to enlist. Plus, my granddad says Chogokin 666. The Sand Pebbles, I remember I was in elementary school when that came out. And it struck me as one of those were the last days of these big prestige films. 55 Days at Peking was another one. Oscar bait. Media Hit says Eisenhower put out a book with Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, his favorite New Testament books, and a preface by him. Don Knotts was a more serious man than Ben Affleck, says Oscar Toe. Look up online Eisenhower and Robert E. Lee. Someone wrote a letter to him, something like 1958, in effect of how dare you have a portrait of Robert E. Lee in the Oval Office. And he explains, calmly and forcefully exactly why he had a portrait of Robert E. Lee on his office wall. So that's it for today. Book club is tomorrow, and I'm going to be discussing the biography of Karl Marx by Francis Wheen. This is it's a warts and all biography. It's not a hagiography at all. And it is better. It is better for that. I don't ascribe to, I'm trying to think of the name of the famous literature professor, this school that, all great artists, must be great men. This fellow twisted himself into knots. Oh, Charles Dickens, despite all the evidence of his personal life, was, truly good man, and Paul Johnson, in that book he wrote, Intellectuals. Of course, I suppose this was somewhat embarrassing for Paul Johnson when it was later revealed that Johnson liked to pay prostitutes to spank him. If you're going to attack people, historical personages, based on their personal lives, for instance, Mark's fathering a bastard child with the family servant, you should have a clean nose before you do that. But some people simply can't resist. So I'll be back on the air tomorrow barring power outages or YouTube deciding to crash my stream for some unknown reason. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already done so. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would, as they say, really hit the spot at this point, my PayPal address, my PayPal account is attached to the address Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.